Hey, it's Jared with a tech tip for you on the Creality Ender 3 V3 SE. It's a mouthful, but this 3D printer is absolutely fantastic, but there are a few things that I have come to understand about this 3D printer that I wanted to talk about in this video. Now, I don't typically talk about 3D printers on this channel, so why am I making this video? Well, my son has gotten into 3D printing. I have a little bit of experience with 3D printing, having one on my shelf in the back, but my son purchased this 3D printer with his own money, and it started out really great. But over a little bit of time, we started having some issues with the prints failing. And there were some things that I identified that I could not find really good answers for online that have to do with maintaining your 3D printer. If you have a Creality Ender 3 V3 SE printer like this one, this is the printer that has the auto leveling bed, then this is for you. So first of all, the issue that started to happen is that the 3D print started failing after probably about 30 minutes to an hour into the print, which is a really frustrating time to have a print fail. Prints that fail right at the beginning, that's fine. We don't waste much filament. We just figure out what the issue was. We just maybe realign the bed and then we're good. That's pretty simple. But my son wasn't experiencing that issue. And so we started trying to figure out what could be causing it. And I really wasn't able to identify what the problem was until I started disassembling the 3D printer to return it. Being that we were having trouble with the auto aligning print surface, and my experience was with the manual one where you adjust the four corners of the bed and manually align it, I thought, let's go with an Ender 3 printer that is manual. Well, that process ended up being even more frustrating because that printer, while being a great printer, was extremely finicky and required manual adjustment constantly. And even after I started printing, we'd have to do manual adjustments just to make sure that things were good. That printer was definitely a lot more finicky and harder to use, especially for my son, than the version 3 SE. And so we ended up going back to our version 3 SE and trying to figure out why was it failing, because there are a lot of people with positive reviews of this printer on YouTube and a lot of positive reviews in Amazon. So what was causing the issue? Well, I identified a couple of things that were contributing. First of all, the print bed here is very stable, and so that isn't going to change because there's no adjustments underneath it. And so if you put a little bit of pressure on your print bed, or when you take the magnetic surface off and reapply it, there's very minimal movements and adjustments that are going to happen maybe because of that. The way that this 3D printer works, it goes and measures 16 different locations on the print bed here, and then it compensates for that as it's printing. So it takes all of those measurements and how things are off a little bit, and then it compensates in how it's printing. And so it's essentially changing the 3D print to compensate for the unlevel bed. So I think that's really great, and it works really well when everything is as expected. But what we were experiencing is a failed print after, like I said, about 30 minutes to an hour, and all of a sudden the print would just fail. It would start spitting filament all over the place, and then we'd have to cancel the print and start over again. And then it would repeat the process. It didn't matter how many times we leveled the bed, tried to make sure that everything was fine, even making some manual adjustments, trying to compensate because we noticed that the 3D print was coming off a little bit. And so we were adjusting the back corner of the bed because we thought, well, maybe that was off, but then the print would start and it would be bad at the start. So I knew that the auto level was not the issue. It had to be something else. Well, it has to do with parts of this 3D printer that don't necessarily come tight from the factory, and parts on the 3D printer that you need to check from time to time. So some of this is just making sure that your 3D printer is good to go from the factory, and then the rest of it is regular maintenance that we need to pay attention to. So you're gonna need your tools that came with your 3D printer for this, because you need to go around your entire 3D printer and check all of these little bolts to make sure that they are tight. Now, I found that all of these little screws are pretty easy to strip out if you're not careful, so you don't want to put too much pressure on them. You just want to make sure that they're tight. And I have made sure that all of these are tight already, but a lot of them were not tight to begin with. And if you can imagine, this needs to be very accurate. This print head needs to be very accurate as it's 3D printing. If it starts to slightly get off a little bit as it continues to print, every pass it's off just a little bit more, eventually that print's going to fail, and that is what was happening here. So there are a lot of screws that you need to make sure that are tight. I would make sure that these two are tight. I would make sure that all of the screws that are on the base of the uprights here are nice and tight, because that could produce a little bit of movement back and forth. Keep in mind, the print head is going back and forth, and it's going up as it continues to print, and everything here needs to be tight. One of the main things that I noticed was that there was a little bit of play in the cross member that goes across. There's also a belt that goes across here, and the print head, of course, goes back and forth. There was a little bit of play here in the printer. Now, our first printer was slightly different than this one. Even though it's the same model, the Ender 3 V3 SE, this particular printer has a belt tensioner. Our first one did not have a belt tensioner. And there's also different features in the software that was not in our original one as well. So you do want to check from time to time to see if there is new software that's available for this printer. When we first had this printer, the software did not prompt to check the bed levels to make sure nothing's changed before you started to print. So you either needed to tell the printer to go through the entire bed leveling process, or just decide not and then hope for the best. But now there's a feature that allows the printer to go and check, and it checks the four corners only to make sure that that hasn't changed. It doesn't have to go through the entire process that takes a lot of time. So it saves a ton of time by just checking the four corners to make sure that it's still the same measurements before it starts the print. And if it does notice that things are off, it will go and do a level. And so that was a great software feature that they added in. So if you don't see that, I would highly recommend that you go and update the software to your 3D printer. So the main culprit was these brackets that these threaded bars go through. And I identified that that was what was causing the issue. These screws here are not supposed to be completely tightened down. They're supposed to be a little loose. And the reason for that is that as this moves up and down the thread, there needs to be just a little bit of give. And in the instructions that come with this particular printer, there was no information about that. It didn't say anything about what you should do with these. But in the instructions for the Ender 3 that we got that requires you completely assembling the unit, it specifically said not to tighten these down. And so I thought to myself, oh, we're not supposed to tighten those down. I wonder how tight or loose they were on the other printer, because they need to be loose enough to have a little bit of give, but they can't be so loose that there's actual play in the movement. And so as you think about this piece of thread here rotating around, if there's play in here, then as it rotates around, it bumps and then starts to push itself up. And then as it goes back down, it bumps and then pushes itself back down. There's too much tolerance in there. And as the print head started to move up, that tolerance would increase to the point where the print would then fail. So being that I couldn't find any information on where these should be set or how these should be adjusted, I did a bunch of testing with different prints, and I think I've got it pretty much figured out. So here's what you need to do. Take your tool and put it in this screw and rotate this around until things feel pretty snug, not tight. You don't want to tighten these down all the way, but you want them to feel pretty snug. And then back this off about almost 90 degrees. I'd say probably about 75 degrees, maybe to 90 degrees. You don't want this to be tight, but you also don't want it to be loose as well. So you're going to do that to both of these. We're going to go till we're snug, and then we're going to back this off about 90 degrees, maybe 75 to 90 degrees. This is something that you're going to need to play with a little bit, and come and check these. I'd say probably about every 10 prints that you run, you should probably check these, because we did not run a lot of prints on our last 3D printer. We only ran, I'd say probably about 20 prints total, and these were so out of tolerance that everything was failing. So let's go ahead and do it for this side as well. We'll go ahead and put the tool in here, go till snug, and then back that off about 90 degrees. Well, we've only ran about 4 prints on this particular printer, and these are already different than the last time that I set them. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for the last one here. We'll go ahead and get to snug and then back that off 90. And so these are going to come loose pretty quick. And as you imagine, as more space starts to build up in there, then things get out of tolerance, and then we start having failed prints. Now, you're also going to want to check other bolts, such as motor mount bolts, just to make sure that those are tight. These are all things that can potentially come tight. There's also the couple here that connects the all thread to the motor, and you're going to want to make sure that that is nice and tight as well, because we don't want that slipping and getting things out of tolerance. This is definitely one that you don't want to put too much pressure on. You want to make sure it's tight, but you don't want to put too much pressure on it because you don't want to strip things out. I found that the metal on these 3D printers is soft, and if you try to tighten things down too much, you could end up stripping things out. So you want to be mindful of all the different moving parts on your 3D printer. You want to make sure that when you hold the carriage here on both sides, then you kind of rock it back and forth just a little bit, not putting too much pressure. You don't want to bend anything, you don't want to hurt anything, but just rocking it back and forth just a little bit, making sure that there's no play. This should be very firm and you shouldn't feel any play in here. If there is any play, then something may have come loose somewhere else, and you want to definitely check all of the different screws that are on the 3D printer just to make sure that nothing came loose, because there are a lot of screws in a lot of different places that should be checked just to make sure that they are snug, and most of them do need to be really tight. And so if you make sure that they are, then you're not going to run into any issues with your 3D printer. Now, there are a lot of screws, such as these screws that hold the uprights in place, both the screws on the back here and the 3 screws that come up from the bottom. Especially the 3 screws that come up from the bottom on both sides here go into very soft aluminum metal. And I found that when I was tightening those down, I didn't want to go super tight because I could tell that the threads were starting to pull, and I didn't want to go super tight. So what I decided to do with those screws is use blue thread locker. Blue thread locker from Loctite is a thread glue that will lock those in place, but blue thread locker is not so intense like red thread locker that you could probably still get those screws out without ruining the threads. Definitely want to be careful because we don't want to strip out the screws, because if we strip them out, whether in putting them in or trying to get them out, then we're going to have problems and our 3D printer is going to be ruined. But being that we don't plan on taking this 3D printer apart, and I definitely want to make sure that all of those stay tight, I put a little dab of blue thread locker on each of the 3 bolts coming up through the bottom on both sides to make sure that we don't have any issues there. And if in the future any screws seem to be coming loose pretty often, I'm definitely going to put a little bit of blue thread locker on those screws just to make sure that I don't have any issues there. Now, lastly is the tensioner that is for the belt here. The belt that comes across, this is moving a lot, obviously, and this belt eventually is going to stretch out a little bit, and there's a tensioner that they installed right here that makes it so that I can add more tension to the belt as that is needed. And so what we need to do to check that is put our tool right in the belt tensioner. And when your printer is really new, you shouldn't have any issues there. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of pushing on the belt with my thumb a little bit here. I want to make sure that it takes a little bit of pressure to push the belt towards the back of the rail. So as I push the belt towards the back of the rail, it should take a little bit of pressure to do that, and the belt should really easily return to its original position, and it should feel like I'm pressing on a rubber band nice and tight. If it's really easy for you to press this belt into the rail, then you need to tighten this down a little bit by rotating the screw maybe about 90 degrees and just seeing if it adds a little bit more tension. You might need to go a little bit further, especially if you've been running a lot of prints on your printer. We don't need to go there yet because everything is nice where that tensioner is located. But over time, as this belt stretches a little bit, that's going to affect the movement of the print head as it moves back and forth and can throw off our print as well. So if your tolerances on everything is good, everything is nice and tight, and you don't have any issues, when you go and do your auto alignment, you should have all of those boxes show up as green, with maybe 1 or 2 of them showing up as blue. If you have a lot of boxes that are showing up as blue, make sure everything is nice and tight. Go through and make sure you're maintaining your device well. Also, make sure that there is nothing underneath your magnetic plate, any debris that might be kind of making this off kilter. Make sure that your magnetic plate is nicely aligned, keeping it clean of debris so that there's nothing that would throw off the alignment here. You also want to check the bed screws as well. There are 4 bed screws here that you can check just to make sure that none of those have come loose, and we want to make sure that those are tight. I don't imagine any reason why those would come loose, but they definitely were not as tight as I would have liked them to be from the factory. So you want to make sure that all of these are tightened down. And this screw back here in the corner even looked a little bit stripped out, not too bad. But I mean, if you look at the view of the camera, this is how much I can move the wrench back and forth in that screw compared to this one up here in the corner, which has a lot less movement. And so you really have to be careful with a lot of these screws just to make sure that you don't strip them out, but you want them nice and snug. I also check these bolts in the back corner here just to make sure those are tight, even though there's nothing that they really do. But they're just really for the alignment of the magnetic print bed here that we're going to put into place ever so gently and let it snap down just like that, making sure that it's nice and aligned. Always making sure that it's clean, because it not being clean can affect the auto alignment as well. And remember that it is writing all of those measurements to the software, and it's manipulating the level of the print head. It's not changing the bed. It's manipulating the print head to compensate for those different alignment measurements that it takes here. So we want to make sure that our print bed is clean, that the magnetic surface underneath it is clean, and that we don't have any debris or anything like that underneath the carriage that's going to move back and forth as well. Make sure everything is clean. One thing that I also don't do is really push on anything or manually move anything. I feel like it's okay down here because this just moves back and forth and it's nice and free, but manually moving everything here, I don't like doing it. It's much easier just to power the unit up and make those adjustments from within the software. Move the print head up and over if you need to. I would do that because as you push on these, it's actually putting bind on the different components here, and we don't want to put bind on the components. We want the motor to control that, which is the way that it was designed. So I hope that that helped. These were just some maintenance things that I came across. Obviously, there's a lot more to maintaining a 3D printer, such as keeping the nozzle clean, stuff like that, that is fairly common practice. But in trying to make sure that our 3D printer just continues to work and doesn't continue to cause problems, I hope that this video helped you in your process of getting nice clean prints and getting a long lifespan out of your Creality 3 V3 SE 3D printer. I'll also be doing a review of this printer, and we'll be comparing it to the Ender 3 as well, which is the manually adjusting one that I talked about earlier. So make sure to check out those videos, subscribe to the channel, check out the links in the description below to some of the tools that we use with our 3D printer that we found extremely useful and adds value to the overall experience. Thanks for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel. We'll see you back in another one soon. Take care.